Rosa the Beloved One 4 by Hakjin Kim. Then he went to Nancy, who lay flat on the bed in the recovery room, receiving a phone call from Olivia, who informed that Paul alone would visit Nancy. He found Nancy look weary after being delivered of a healthy baby girl, 1 year after the first one, but she seemed to feel relieved because she could feel a hope in her second baby. Since the first one was born with a kidney failure, Nancy had made an effort to have the baby receive treatment with every possible means. Paul knew what was happening in Nancy's mind. She had been clutching at straws while her son had kidney dialysis treatment. After she found out that her immediate family, including her, didn't have the same blood and tissue types for a kidney transplant, she had to put her son's name on a waiting list until a suitable donor kidney was located. And then she decided to have the second baby as soon as possible for her first son, who needed a sibling as Paul suggested. Looking at Nancy, Paul had been heartbroken, so he supported her with his money and time by trying everything he could do for his daughter. He registered his grandson's name at a special hospital for a future kidney transplant in advance. When Helen was 1 year old, Paul's grandson went through a kidney transplant and got well enough to spend time with his peers. Everything around Paul went fine except Nancy, who became a divorcee. Helen, a blonde toddler, grew up well in a loving family. And then Paul could focus on his own life, expanding his business. After looking at his watch, Paul gets in the van to leave for his shop and sighs, mumbling, "Fate works in a strange way," as the saying goes. Every time he remembers what happened to his family 2 years ago, he can feel his heart freeze. He still shakes his head when it comes to the horrible incident. It was a terrible car accident that Nancy had. She was injured seriously, and her 2 children were worse. Her son, who had grown up as a healthy teen, was in critical condition, and her daughter, Helen, died at the scene. At the worst news in his whole life, Paul collapsed and almost lost the will to live when he heard that his grandson ended up in the hospital. Eventually, Paul and Olivia became hospitalized because they couldn't live everyday life in a state of shock. As they knew that Nancy was recovering from her head injury, they got out of the hospital. They had to go through their hardship for Nancy, who had been devastated by losing her 2 kids. Nancy, being discharged from the hospital, stayed with her parents. She couldn't be free of her mishap, so she stayed up every night, though she took pills for depression. Her state of mind seemed to get worse by being treated with more pills. It was heartbroken for Paul to see his loving daughter, who never spoke to nor looked at anyone. In the meantime, a very odd thing happened around Paul. One day at his study, he found a piece of official paper, which was issued by the hospital, where Nancy and her 2 kids had been for a while after the car accident. It read that late Helen's blood type was B. At first Paul passed it, but he began to think about the blood type of Nancy's family. Nancy's blood type was A, and her divorced husband was A. Then it was impossible for their children to be type B. It struck Paul that the babies were switched at the hospital, whoever did that on purpose or not. He was stunned by the unbelievable truth. But his mind went in a different direction at once, thinking of his daughter Nancy, who had never gone out even for a walk after she lost her 2 kids. The only way that Paul could do for Nancy seemed to find her own flesh and blood, who she wouldn't have thought of. From that day forward, Paul made a plan to get Nancy her blood and began to find the nurse who was in charge of the newborn unit where his granddaughter was put after birth. Soon he was told from the hospital that the nurse on duty on the day when Nancy gave birth to a baby girl already resigned, and there was no mistake done by that nurse. The response given by the hospital official made Paul feel discouraged, but Paul couldn't let it go. He set out in search of his real granddaughter. The next year, Paul found out Linda's location by the help of a professional detective agent who Paul commissioned. It wasn't hard to know her whereabouts, because of a visitor's book of the hospital. According to the information given by the detective, much to his surprise, Linda has lived in Paul's neighborhood. Paul was told that she was a high school teacher in the West, but packed up after losing her husband, because she couldn't stay alone far from her daughter, Anne. Since then Linda got used to go to Anne to give a hand. Seeing Anne and Rosa every day has given Linda a sense of purpose to her life. On hearing of Rosa, Paul was delighted because he knew by intuition that she must be the one that should have been his biological granddaughter, in the same way his late Helen must have been Linda's granddaughter. And he moved on to fix this tough situation. As everything seemed clear, Paul told Olivia what happened to their family and discussed what to do with her. Like a retired history teacher, Olivia suggested that they clam up until they made it to an amicable settlement. The first thing they had to do was that they would be around Miller's family to collect data about Rosa's schedule. That would make things easier for them to contact Rosa. Though they knew that they had no way to be intimate with Rosa, they had to rack their brains to get her stuff like her hair or her toothbrush for a DNA test. While Olivia started out as a high school substitute teacher of Rosa's school district, Paul registered his hardware store to fix stuff in the high school. They decided not to scare Rosa, their biological granddaughter, any more since that night at the subway station. From then on, Rosa becomes a beacon of hope for them, especially for their ill daughter Nancy. Linda comes back her home with her dog instead of Anne's. She needs to take a rest to calm down herself after encountering Paul. She also has to think what she can do if Paul asks her to disclose the happening. Though she has done nothing bad to him, his presence causes her to have butterflies in her stomach. She dials Anne's number and says, "What time are you available today? I'll see you there at 3. In the cafeteria, Linda finds Anne sitting by the window, who seems to check cell phone messages. Anne, working as a social worker near her house, can have a break for a half hour any time. Anne looks up and says, "Mom, why here to talk? You'll stay with me tonight. Do you have some secret for me?" "The coffee in this cafe tastes good, you know," Linda smiles. "I'll have a latte, please." "Thanks," Linda says to a waitress. "Listen, Anne. I'm gonna say things about 17 years ago when you gave birth to Rosa. It may sound crazy." Linda starts to talk. Linda takes a deep breath and tells Anne what happened in the newborn unit and Paul, who appeared at the corner of Anne's house around noon. Anne interrupts Linda. "You mean Paul? PP Hardware Store?" "Maybe. I saw him getting out of that van," Linda responds. Linda continues with what was going on that day, and finishes saying that she's been dubious about IED wristbands that then a nurse worked on by mistake. Soon Anne asks, "So you are sure the babies were switched or what?" "I don't know it exactly. I've thought it might happen. I should have called the nurse about the ID band at that moment," Linda says. "No, it's impossible. Rosa is my daughter." "Mom, you should never say that again," Anne shouts with an angry voice. "Yeah, absolutely," Linda nods. 30 minutes later, Anne and Linda rise their feet together. Linda gets in her car to go back to Anne's home, and Anne goes back to the office.